Carlton King is a former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in jihadi organisation. My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations. But actually, what we really do is we look at geopolitics in the round, from the micro to the macro. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at the macro, and we've been looking at massive issues. The war in Iran, the potential loss of the petrodollar. We've looked at how the whole edifice, to be fair, of US hegemony could fall, etc., etc. Today I'm going to narrow it in a little bit. Now I'm going to narrow it into football. And the reason for that is that the World Cup's coming, and it is going to be held in a tripartite of countries, basically relating to North America. So Canada, US, and Mexico. And so what we're looking at here is what are the differences in terms of how that is going to function with what we've previously understood about the World Cup and about just the fluidity of it and the plurality of people from all over the world turning up to watch their team, and just the colourfulness of that, how people have turned up from different regions, from different countries, with their clothing different, food different, everything that just turns up as football fans do in order to support their team when they're in this absolutely most prestigious of world events, the World Cup. However, we're now getting statements and getting more and more information that suggests that at least in the United States, that various individuals are going to have problems just being allowed into the country. And some of that is because of the countries that have basically fought their way to the World Cup, because the President of the United States, Trump, has banned some countries, nationals, from even coming to the United States, regardless of the World Cup or not. And hence, therefore, the fans won't be able to support them. And then others have been done on a more selective basis, that being individuals who have been deemed to be a threat to security. Now, being an individual who ran the political intelligence for Euro 96 and the movements of individuals through ports or through Eurostar coming into the United Kingdom and working the political intelligence aspect, and obviously looking at individuals who may well have been terrorists or being just, let's say, politically deviant in terms of coming to the United Kingdom to cause political harm to the state insofar as public disorder. I can understand that, not a problem. That's always been the case. That, frankly, if you knew that individuals were coming just to, at one end, cause terrorism, and at the other end, cause public disorder, in terms of, from a political perspective, let's say right-wingers coming, bringing people with them, behind them, to cause just trouble and strife, then, of course, if you can prove that, which is another factor, so it's not just you believing that, there's a proof factor involved in that, then, of course, that makes sense that you'd have such a position that said we would seek to ban these individuals from coming in, as it was in that case, to the United Kingdom. But that's not what we're talking about here. Because what's happening with the security banner now in the United States is if you have been seen or you are perceived to have been in some way, shape or means criticising the President of the United States, Donald Trump, then you can be basically refused an ESTA. And once you're refused, then that's you done over. You will not be able to come to the World Cup, especially in the United States. Now, as I said, all these areas are grey to grey zones to black to white. So you've got that middle section. And I've seen nothing wrong with individual state organs saying to individuals who you know are causing trouble and strife, and you know you can actually prove that they're causing trouble and strife, to say, you're not coming in. Not a problem. As I said, I was involved in doing that. I was leading that aspect for the United Kingdom, people moving through, as I said, Eurostar or through airports, etc. Many, many years ago. Not a problem. However, when that's just about criticism on YouTube or on X or on whatever other plethora of media posts there are, and that relates to something that is often said about the president, but not suggesting any violent action or even any public disorder type action, then maybe we do need to question whether that's correct or not. Is that a position that should be held, particularly for the World Cup? Now, you know, countries can do what they want in terms of allowing people in or not allowing them into the lands, but the World Cup is held in a certain esteem, and the whole point of it has been, and wherever I've seen it, I don't care if it's in South Africa, in Russia, in Germany, I'm just thinking the last couple of them, in Qatar, wherever it's been held, people from all over the world have been allowed to enter, and they've said, yeah, fill your boots, come in, enter, watch the matches, support your team, because with that comes the thrill of football. You know, when it was in Japan and Korea, I can remember a certain noise that people had, that the Japanese fans with a sort of a high-pitched, females with a high-pitched voice, and it just said, oh, fantastic. Those are the Japanese fans. And the vuvuzelas being blown in South Africa, or the sort of the Russians did a woo, you know, sort of sound. And you know, and other people, when they were playing those teams, were, you know, having to compete against them with their sort of whatever it was they were using. You know, like thinking back to that, what was it called? The sort of hammer that the Icelandics had when they all turned and made a noise when they were, you know, when they were playing against another team. You know, especially when it was the host team, sort of, in order to support them, if you will. I think that's the best way of putting it. In order to support them, there's no malice involved in that. And so what you don't want is wholesale banning, I guess I can say. So, you know, if you come from Congo, you can't go. If you come from various African states that the president hasn't liked and said they're not coming in anymore, bosh, so what happens to their fans? Where's their support? That's not what the World Cup's about, frankly. So therefore you should have and must have. And you can see what I'm trying to be is absolutely, I'm trying to be fair on all sides. I'm not coming down on one side or the other. I'm conscious of security. I have been throughout my life. Spent 30 years involved in aiding security, working for the United States at one stage. So I've got security, I understand. But when it's just criticism of a leader, you know, that's happened forever, hasn't it? Hasn't criticism of a leader happened forever? And even when it's gone to a state where criticism of a leader might be looked upon poorly, in terms of the World Cup, people have been allowed in. So why now? Why? It's suggested that Dom Jolly example won't be able to go. There's even talk about Gary Lineker being said he won't go. And there's one guy who wrote on his social media that because he criticised the United States, he got back from the US Embassy saying he's a security risk. Now this guy's just a bloody journalist. But he's got back saying you won't be able to come to the World Cup because you're a security risk to the president. That becomes problematic to me. And by the way, that guy's a Brit. He's a well-known Brit. Just who just writes and puts his stuff out there. That's problematic, because you're taking away a lot of, as I said, just a lot of the glory and the beauty of the World Cup, and just how it resonates peace in a strange way. It's just one of the things that happens when fans all come together and they gloriously basically watch their side to see what it does. And, as I've said before, even when I was working the 96 operation, working hand in glove with the football hooligan guys who were looking at the known British hooligans, and then we were trying to assess the foreign hooligans that were coming in. Because what they did do, some of them, they came some weeks before to Britain, and some Brits went out to, I think it was to France, I can remember correctly, we're going back some time now, to sort of agree where battles would be, so that they could bring their battling Brits and battling Poles or whomever else were fighting, or wanted to fight one another to see who would be, or Germans or whomever, who would be the number one fighters in that era in terms of what they perceived to be glory via football hooliganism. So we assessed that, looked at that, and we were able to stop those particular individuals from particular countries, obviously our lads from actually going to the matches, the Brit lads from going to the matches who were going to do that sort of stuff, and prevent the Europeans from coming in who were going to do that sort of stuff. But as I said, it's evidenced. That's the whole point. We weren't just blanketly saying, some bloke's written something. And yes, I know, first thing people are going to say is, well, there was no social media. So, absolutely. So it made it much more difficult. So now you could look at social media and say, this guy's pretty much straightforward. He doesn't like the politics of the President of the United States. So he's articulating that in his, whatever it might be, his influencer mode or his tweet or whatever it might be. But you know pretty well that the guy's not going to do anything. Now, before you say, well, we're arresting people in the United Kingdom for writing tweets, true. And if you've listened to me on this programme before, you'll know I'm against that. You'll know that I believe that heavy-handed policing like that, at the behest of government, I should add, in arresting individuals just because they put tweets out, is problematic, because I believe, having spent 30 years in this field of secret intelligence as it relates to public disorder, public order, subversion, extremism, terrorism, etc. in that domain, what I will tell you is what heavy-handedness generally does is it creates martyrs and creates individuals, and I don't mean martyrs because you died, but martyrs because they put forward the cause and then directs other people towards that cause, and then individuals look at it and say, well, all the crime going on, and you've picked this person up for just writing something on a social media platform, and then you start getting the undermining of criminal justice itself. So for me, I'm against that. So yeah, I'm not saying the United States is the only country that does that, looks at social media, and as a result of looking at social media says this is not the way you need to go. But I think as long as you did it correctly, and that is in terms of not putting any threat forward, I still think even here now, and notice I'm saying that, and I'm relenting as I'm saying it. I'm actually quite sad as I'm saying even here in the United Kingdom, that you could write a tweet, and as long as there's no violent intent, no extremist racism, nothing that would be deemed as illegal within it, you could criticise the king. You could criticise Starmer. That's not a problem. And somebody from abroad could do that, criticise the policies of the United Kingdom government, as long as they weren't going to carry out any activity. Now, for you then just to blanketly turn around, any negative activity I should say, for you now blanketly just to turn around and make an assumption that a negative criticism of what the President of the United States is doing in itself relates to a security threat to the President of the United States, ipso facto that this individual may well be deemed or perceived to be a terrorist, so let's prevent him before he could carry out some terrorist activity. I think that then takes it too far. And this is what I'm saying if it relates to our own country, if we were doing the same thing. Especially when, and this is the point I'm making more above and beyond just you having no right to enter another man's country, another woman's country, depending on who the president is, yeah, you having no right to go into that country and then putting whatever criteria they want on you for you entering, that's true. However, when you take on a world event like the World Cup, or if it were the Olympic Games, let's argue, when you take on these world events, the whole point is, particularly with the World Cup, because it's all about the spectators, right? Particularly with the World Cup, even above and beyond the Olympic Games, particularly the World Cup. When you take that on board, surely there must be a contractualisation that says you will allow the fans of the various countries who take part in the World Cup to come and watch their team within the World Cup. Otherwise, you could actually get to the point whereby people might turn around and say, actually, it's unfair. Because we had no support and the other team had massive support, they've got home advantage. You know, because the other team are a European team as a general rule, and you can say most Europeans, unless of course they tend to write something about President Trump, can basically come to the country. But you're saying teams from Africa, or teams from some parts of Asia, or teams from some parts of South America can't attend. Surely you're then giving home advantage to those countries whose supporters can attend. You know, that then becomes problematic, and it takes away the whole ethos of the World Cup. And in the end, I don't think it does the United States any favours. You know, the whole point of the World Cup in the United States, from the chairman of the World Cup committee, was supposedly to kick-start again, so it's like the third kick-start, again, football in the United States. And also to give a feel of that to, in a football-mad country anyway, like Mexico, so that's not a problem, and to, again, offer up an opportunity to make the Canada more football-loving. So are you not taking something away when you turn around and then say, but the fans can't turn up? You know, I'm talking about the blanket ones now, so you've got the blanket countries that are now limited from going to the United States. And then now you've got this other, just as insidious an angle that says, if we look back on your social media and you have in any way, shape or means said negative things about the President of the United States, we're not going to allow you in either. I mean, that can't be right, surely. I mean, please, if you think it is, ladies and gentlemen, come back to me. I've told you my position. I've told you what I did in the past. I've told you that I looked out for this same sort of issue in the United Kingdom, but of course it was a robust system. It wasn't just some bloke saying I don't like Britain, or Brits won't think they won the war and they're great, or Brits blew me auntie up in the war, or whatever it might be. You know what I mean? So therefore I hate them, and I hate at that stage the Queen, or I hate whomever was the Prime Minister. I think at the time was it Tony Blair? Anyway, whomever it was, I hate them. And so therefore, I think it was Margaret Thatcher actually. No, it wasn't. It was maybe John Major. Anyway, Blair or Major. I hate them, and therefore I want them to get beat by my team. Well, frankly, if you were playing that message, you'd be arresting or not allowing any Scot across the. I'm being flippant now. A Scottish football supporter across the border, because Scottish football supporters want everybody to win, but for England. So, I'm being flippant there. But you get what I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen. What I'm saying is that are we not devaluing the whole ethos of the World Cup in actually doing this? And hence the reason why I'm speaking out about it, because it may sound as though it's a small issue, but it isn't, because this is one of our primary collective sporting events. It's the event. Football is the really, I'd say, yeah, I'm going to say it. I think football is the most egalitarian of sports because you can kick a ball around like Pele did that wasn't a ball, in fact, that was a coconut with meshing around it, and you're dirt poor, but you can kick that about and actually dream of being on the Brazilian team. You know, you've got no money, you have not 2 pennies to rub together, but you can dream of being on the Brazilian team because you believe, rightly or wrongly, but you believe that everybody's got a chance to be that great footballer. You know, I mean, that's what Ronaldo said. You know, he had 2 bad legs as a kid growing up, but he still could believe that he could play for Portugal, that he could be somebody in terms of football. You know, this is the beauty of the game. And supporters who didn't make the team, because let's face it, 99.9999% of us will never make our national team, right? What's the next best thing we do? We support it. We go out and support it. We go out and see the guys who did make it, the ones that we wanted to be like, who did make it. And then with that comes that kind of national pride when the guys who did make it to, you know, out of the league part of the World Cup into the knockouts. You know, there's that feel, oh, we made it into the knockouts. And then once you made it into the knockouts, you move on and you say, oh, can we make it into the quarterfinals, you know, to the last 32, last quarterfinals, you know, we move on. And that excitement, this is why it's beamed around the world. Because for those who can't make it to that spectacle, we show it around the world. But what we shouldn't be doing is preventing people from making it to that spectacle. We shouldn't be preventing people from not experiencing that come by a moment of you know, putting your arms around the supporters from another country because their team's been knocked out, say, and then they come for what's my second best team? Oh, my second best team's England. My team's gone, but my second best team is England. You know, so I'm going to be supporting the English. I can remember, I think it was the Scottish supporting Roger Milla doing his bits in Ivory Coast. You know, that type of thing, and they're all together, all the, you know, completely different country, completely different continent, but they were supporting because they want England to get beat, and so therefore they were supporting them. I mean, this is fantastic stuff. It's this unity and unison, even if it comes from a position sometimes of wanting your closest or dearest neighbour or even your historical foe to be beaten. As long as you're doing it in a friendly way and not in a gratuitous way, then surely that's a positive thing. Why would you want to stop that by putting restrictions on fans moving into your country to see the matches? Why would you want to do that? Really? Why would you want to do that? And especially people who you know are going to go back home. Now, there is some position that might suggest that if you knew a whole lot of people from a country with what they call pressure to emigrate, and unfortunately pressure to emigrate countries are often countries where the standard of living is low. But of course, if you can afford to go to the World Cup, frankly, you're probably not one of the poorer people within that country. You're probably one of the wealthier people from within that country. So the pressure to emigrate is probably a lot less than your average of the Europeans who will be allowed in. It's because they're probably wealthy and or relatively wealthy and don't want to overstay in the United States. And, you know, up until a few years ago, the number one overstays in the United States actually were Brits. So there isn't a blanket ban on Brits. Obviously now it's more South Americans. And, you know, he's talking about a blanket ban on some Central and South American countries. That's not the spirit. It's not the spirit. It's definitely not the spirit on banning African countries from coming in. Blanket ban. Right? People who are not going to overstay. Blanket ban. That's not the spirit. Blanket ban from somebody who might be coming to watch from an Asian country who's made their way, a less wealthy Asian country, who's made their way into the World Cup. Blanket ban. Just because the president doesn't like the country. Surely when he signed to take on the World Cup, that was taken into account, and some of the more harsher or regressive elements of US immigration should have been basically put on the table and said, well, for this period of time, we need to allow these people in, even if you've got some, in the modern term, some beef against that nation that you don't want to allow them to come in. But for the period of the World Cup, surely you should allow that. Anyway, that's my thoughts on allowance. Now, the other factor is that's pressing in terms of the World Cup, and I think it also has to do with this, frankly, this idea that anybody who says anything negative about the President of the United States is a security risk, and therefore adds impetus to this other aspect I'm now going to speak about, is we are now talking about, and what I'm saying, the football fraternity in many countries is now talking about actually boycotting the World Cup. Now that would be absolutely negative in terms of, for the United States and in terms of growing football in the United States. It may well be, depending on one's point of view, the right thing to do if one perceives that a country has overstepped the mark. The powers that be didn't allow Russia to take part even when they overstepped the mark and invaded somewhere. So there is a question of double standards, which is one of the reasons why it was brought up straight away. The Russians have not been killing civilians on the same level that the United States and Israel have been killing civilians in Iran, example, right? So therefore, shouldn't the United States not be allowed to play? So there's people saying, don't allow the United States to play. So that's one area where it is. Second one is boycott the United States World Cup. Others are saying, but still go to Canada and still go to Mexico. Others are saying, don't go to Mexico because it's too dangerous, because the cartels quite recently actually have taken some horrendous actions against the other vying cartels for the drugs trade. So there is a suggestion that it may well be too dangerous for people to go to Mexico. I don't think that's the case. I think that the cartels love football. I think that they don't want to do anything that undermines the football, frankly. I think it sounds strange, but that has been my assessment. When I used to look at example, at one stage, I was on the Colombian section. I used to look at Colombia. Some of the primary... When Colombia was great at football and got to the World Cup, the reason they actually got to the World Cup was because the cartels put the money in to create what was required for the clubs in Colombia to bring up grassroots players to become good players on the world stage and indeed let them fly out around the world and play for primary, like Tino Asprilla, play for big teams around the world, and therefore then come back and they paid for coaches, top coaches, to come into Colombia and coach the Colombians. And therefore, when the Colombians played in that era, one of the people who put up a lot of the money was Pablo Escobar, but also people from the Cali cartel, in addition to the Medellin cartel, which was the primary area that Pablo was involved with. But the Cali cartel put a lot of money into these football teams, and therefore the last thing they wanted was for football teams to look poor when they played other football teams. And this would be the case today for the Mexicans. And for sure, the cartels would be hated if they prevented a problem. If they created a problem, not prevented a problem, if they created a problem that meant that the Mexican team, which is okay presently, and you've got some players playing in the Premiership and in other leagues around the world, and, have a chance at doing something, if they undermine that in any way, shape or means, it would be very bad practice for the cartels. So I can nigh on say that you'll be safe going to Mexico, because at that stage, the cartels were saying, don't do anything that undermines Mexican capacity for the World Cup, right? So To me, that's pretty clear. And I'm sure also, and I haven't done it, so I don't know. I'm just going from my time, but I said when I was working in Columbia, from the perspective of the special branch at Scotland Yard. But I'm pretty sure that the people in the private security sector working for the World Cup authorities, that they will basically probably even have met some of the leading cartels and got assurances that there wouldn't be a problem. That would be something that I would have done if I was working in the private sector with that. I would have gone and seen the top players and said, listen, please, can you, make sure that nothing happens during the World Cup? It's to your advantage. And I'm sure that the powers that be, in terms of President Fox and others, that they will have been making sure that there are connections and agreements that the cartels don't do anything at this particular period of time that undermines the World Cup for Mexico. Now, obviously for Canada, that's a different kettle of fish. It should be easy, straightforward, not a problem as far as the Canadians are concerned. And I think that you've got the position right now where the Canadians are trying to push themselves out. And when I say push themselves out, I'm saying push themselves out from under the cloak, if you will, of the United States to actually show that they're a different country, rather than just an appendage of the US, i.e. the US is 51st state. I think they want to show the difference. So they'll pull out all the, ticker tape and all the cards for them to be perceived as a great place to be. Plus, you've also got to look at this. For Canada, that's a great opportunity to suggest to people, come to Canada as a place to holiday. Because let's face it, vacationing individuals from around the world makes a massively healthy bank balance for nations. To some extent, we in the United Kingdom live off that. The fact that people come to Britain to see what we've got to offer, Shakespeare, movies, history, blah, blah, blah. France absolutely lives from that. With Paris being the number one attraction in the world, they're living from that up to very, very recently. Obviously, Dubai was living off that, and this will be the downfall of Dubai, by the way, the fact that it's no longer safe and secure. That will be the end of it. They spent trillions, and it were bringing in trillions, and very, very wealthy people were going there. They're going to lose out on that. Anyway, I spoke about that previously in a previous pod, but I will actually speak about that again at some stage. But this is how the Gulf, particularly Dubai and the United Arab Emirates, other parts of the UAE, that have put so much money into tourism. To be fair, Saudi's done the same, utilising sport to be able to. All that's gone to naught. So what I'm saying is, for countries to be able to actually have a great World Cup means good money for that country. And President Trump should think about that too. It really, and I know people want to visit the United States anyway, or tend to want to, although the numbers of Europeans going to the United States has actually dropped. So maybe President Trump should think more about that, because right now, last year, the numbers dropped tremendously about Europeans visiting, spending good European money in the United States. So what you don't want to do is undermine that any further. And this, what's going on now about looking at people's social media and barring them, is not going to be good for the US. Even for the US. Yeah, people want to go to Hollywood, people want to go to New York, people want to go to Florida, Disney's and all the rest of it. But surely to undermine that by what's going on now is negative for the United States. It really is. Even the United States can't sustain that. It's not good. So it's my plea, really. Obviously, it's not going to go anywhere, but it would be my plea to the President of the United States to turn away from the course that he's on right now. Say to Immigration Customs Enforcement, or Immigration and Customs on Border, or immigration in terms of the State Department, who are not allowing people to enter the country, that all of that gets looked at and one starts to think a little bit differently about it and is more open and more obliging to the fans who want to come and see this extravaganza in not too many months' time now. This is the pinnacle for many footballers' careers. It's the pinnacle for their families, to be fair. For their families. It's the pinnacle. You can't get any higher. Surely we shouldn't be trying to scupper it on the basis of some type of petty politics. To my mind, if the World Cup is sabotaged like this, and I talk about all sorts of things and all sorts of conflicts, and I explain conflicts that people don't even want to listen to, like example, the Sudan or Somalia or whatever, or, the Kashmir conflict with India, Pakistan, whatever. I cover them all in the programme, right? So I'm not in any way myopic in my view. But what I'm saying is we need to look at this, and I'm going to say it loud and clear. The World Cup is one of the unifying factors in the world as it is today. It really is. One of the great unifying factors. And I would just hope that the US in particular don't scupper that on the altar of correctness as it relates to what people think about President Trump, right? Don't undermine the future of a great event and of the unity of a great event and of the United States team. Let's just take the United States team. The United States team is actually very good. Don't undermine that capacity of your own team by being petty on not allowing people to enter the country to watch their team. Don't do that. Don't let the World Cup in the Americas, but really people will think the United States, be undermined by this position. Please, I beseech thee, going into some sort of Shakespeare stuff, but no, please, reconsider. Aid the fans to get there. Aid them to see their teams from all over the world. Don't undermine this global unity of the one real global game that has no restrictions on it in terms of who can make it, as a general rule. If you're going to be a superb cyclist, frankly, you ain't going to make it unless you've got the kit. If you're going to be a superb swimmer, again, if you haven't got the kit and the right swimsuit and you haven't got the swimming pools that you can train in every day, you're probably not going to make it. But you can kick around a coconut and you can be then great. Okay? You can. You can have zero and be great in this one game. This game that to me epitomizes the world and the unity of the peoples of the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave you with that. Yeah, for some they might perceive it as lightweight, but I hope I've explained to you why it isn't. Why this whole subject is of the utmost importance. Because, albeit that only a small fraction of people may listen to the political analysis that I give on issues of war and peace, economy, fiscal control, neocolonialism, even future of robotics, future of currencies, etc., practically everybody in the world, man and woman now, will have some feel for this great game they call football. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you will listen to me again next week.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.